Hey, Brandon, it's Rob in Chicago with Jetwine, and I just wanted to say attaboy on that episode with Rich Pickett. I really enjoyed it. I had a chance to interview Rich a couple of years ago for a story, and I really enjoyed it, but I learned so much more from your show. And I wanted to touch on something that you both touched on, which is that entrepreneurial spirit, that readiness to look outside the lines, that readiness to be available when someone says, gee, I wish we knew someone who could handle that. And that it's not always necessary that you have all the qualifications on paper to handle a new task. That's how I got my first chance to start writing many years ago when I was with a journalist who said he didn't want to write this story about an airport because he didn't really know anything about it and he didn't care. And I said, I'll do it. I've had many flying opportunities come along like that I've been able to take advantage of. Years ago, I had a chance to teach at the journalism school at Northwestern for 5 years because they said they needed somebody, and I said, I'll do it. But again, I think it's important that we mention that not all jobs, not all the good stuff in your life is going to come from a job offer that's written on paper somewhere or that you find online. Sometimes you need to stay in touch with people and they learn about what you're interested in and you hear about them. And I wish that more pilots understood that they are the PIC of their career. And sometimes you have to make the career for yourself as opposed to waiting for it to come along. But thank you for raising this really interesting topic, and I hope your family has a good holiday out there, and stay safe, stay healthy, and keep up the good work.
Well, Rob, you know what, man? I couldn't have said it any better myself. So thank you for sending that into the show. And, today, as we move forward, this is actually going to be a part 2 sort of Rich Pickett's story. And, if you thought the last week was pretty interesting, wait till you hear the story this week. I'm going to level with you. I kind of, I debated whether or not I was going to actually do this because this is a story about COVID. And I know that that's literally the last thing anybody wants to hear. I get it. Me too. But it's Rich Pickett's story about going through it. He literally almost died, but he recovered. And the story of how it went is amazing. And then he was able to use his experiences in going through it and the information he sent to the FAA to work with the FAA on how we're going to improve the use of the vaccine moving forward, which of course is the news of the day, is that both the Pfizer and Moderna ones have been approved for emergency use, both by the government at large and by the FAA, with a 48-hour waiting period after each shot. So again, if you're just totally so tired of COVID that you don't want to hear about this, I understand. But I think this is really important news, and it's something that we need to get out and need to understand because as pilots, this affects every single one of us, controllers as well, because our medical authorizations, which kind of roughly coincide with like a second class, is the exact same story. So here we go. This from the FAA, and this is the one about the Pfizer vaccine. It also applies to the Moderna one, I think, in exactly the same way. But from Washington, the FAA says, following the emergency use authorization from the U.S. FDA for Pfizer and the COVID-19 vaccine, the FAA has determined that pilots may receive the vaccine under the conditions of their FAA-issued airman medical certification. FAA air traffic controllers who are subject to FAA medical clearance may also receive the vaccine. To maintain the highest level of safety in the NAS, the agency will require aviation professionals with medical certifications or medical clearances to observe a period of 48 hours following the administration of the vaccine before conducting safety-sensitive aviation duties such as flying or controlling air traffic. Because the Pfizer vaccine requires 2 doses, 21 days apart for maximum effectiveness, this waiting period applies after each dose. The FAA anticipates taking no additional measures to ensure safety after the initial window for side effects closes. However, the agency's medical professionals will continuously monitor the initial distribution of the novel vaccine and documented clinical results and will adjust these recommendations as needed. The FAA will evaluate vaccines from other manufacturers as they receive FDA authorization in the coming weeks and months and will advise pilots and controllers of any waiting periods required for those vaccines. The FAA applies similar brief waiting periods after administration of other vaccines, including those for tuberculosis and typhoid. The FAA encourages Americans to receive COVID-19 vaccinations as authorized by the FDA. This policy announcement pertains to a specialized group of FAA-certified professionals who perform safety-sensitive aviation duties. And for more information, you can go to the medical certification page at faa.gov. So no matter where you fall on this whole topic, I think this is probably going to be the way out for everybody. Now, if you haven't had it or you've survived it or whatever, it's up to you whether or not you want to take the vaccine, I suppose. For now, there's no actual requirement for you to have to do it. But luckily, as more and more people get this, herd immunity will develop and so forth. And, we can hopefully get back to something resembling the reality that we had before this. And who knows, maybe even better. But today, we're going to take a step back to last March, April timeframe when this stuff was really getting bad, when it first came up and when we first really didn't know what to do. Well, Rich, as usual, was there first. He got it. It did not go well. Luckily, he survived, but there's a lot more to it than that. So I want to take today's episode to hear from Rich himself, what it was like to go through COVID, through a coma, to almost die, and then to come back to be able to fly again. Yeah, so when the pandemic started, the world was kind of just smacked in the face with it real fast. Everyone knew it was in China, and the next thing you know, it was like, oh wait, no, it's everywhere. But people who are traveling a lot, that was sort of the scary place. And I have a coworker who was able to get back into the United States like a day before they shut everything down, and he'd been in Europe. And same thing for actually a previous guest on this show. Pam was stuck over there, or almost got stuck over there really bad. And, that was the big fear, was that people who are traveling around are going to spread it. And obviously you were doing a lot of, I think I saw briefly before the pandemic hit that you were doing some relief missions and so on. And the next thing I know, someone from your family put on Facebook that, you were on a ventilator in the ICU, and it just sort of happened. So do you know where you got sick and when and how it all went down? And you had quite a case.
Yeah, it was interesting because when I saw the first cases in Wuhan, late December and then into January, I said, we're going to be in trouble. And my background's in pharmacology, and so I understand the science fairly well. I'm not current in it, but I understand the constructs. And I knew we were going to be in trouble, that this was going to happen. And so I was flying a lot, flying all over, the U.S. and Mexico and the Caribbean and so forth, right when this thing first started. In fact, I remember being down in one community, in a small community in Baja, with some Canadians were there, and they said, we've been told we have to get back immediately. And I went, this is not good. So I came back and I was doing flying. I was teaching in various turbines, and so teaching new owners. And then I dropped off a citation back east in New Jersey, and I had to get home. And I went, oh, now I got to go to the airlines. My family didn't want me to fly. This is early on when, things are starting to shut down in New York. They had a high fatality rate in ICU, 80%, and so forth. And I said, well, I need to go back. I need to help a friend. So I did that, dropped off the plane, and flew back. And the airlines were careful, but not as careful as they are now. I wasn't as careful as I am now. I had a mask, but I had an old construction mask, right? An old painter's mask. And, you couldn't get masks at that time. And so I tried to stay away from everybody. But it seems to be somewhere on that return trip is where I contracted it. Because both before that, I had been isolated to very few people. And after that, I was pretty much isolated. And so when I got it initially, it was just a scratch in my throat, and I thought, oh, this is just kind of a winter scratch. A few days later, then it progressed. And it progressed then more into a cold and in my lungs and my nasal passages, and I thought, again, this is just a cold. It can't be COVID. And then finally, the fever started, and the fevers would go from 97 to 103.9, and I just had these massive chills and everything else like that. So I got all my doctors. Kai said, oh, you need to get a test. So I went and get the test. As I was waiting for the test, he said, don't take the antibiotics, and we'll wait, and until we know the test results, et cetera. Well, at that time, Quest was inundated with testing. So the days progressed, no test. I delayed taking antibiotics, and I didn't think I had COVID because I had taste and smell. Boy, I'd eat things, didn't have much of an appetite, but hey, it tasted fine. So about 4 days, 5 days after the test, my sister dropped off. My sister has a MD, PhD. She dropped off a pulse oximeter because I didn't have one handy. And I measured it, and when I'd stand, my blood oxygen would drop to 78 to 80. Not a good thing. When I was sitting, it was in the 80s. Mine normally is in the high 90s. So I called my doctor on the phone, and I said, this isn't good. She says, no, and your test results aren't back. You need to get to the ER. So they wanted to call an ambulance. I didn't want to bother the neighbors with all the noise. So I said, Jane, just drive me to Kaiser. We're only a couple miles away. Let me go, shave at least. So I went and shaved. I was terrible. I didn't think I was going to make it. So we go to the ER. Jane has to drop me off outside. She's not able to come inside. Literally in the parking lot, they said, stay in your car to her. We'll get him. They put me in a wheelchair. I barely just waved to Jane because that's all the strength I had. And by that time, even before I went to the ER, I told my doctor, what about a do not resuscitate? And she says, I think that might be a good idea because the outcome's not good if this doesn't work, if you have to be ventilated, et cetera. At that time, it was pretty bad. So I get into the ER at Kaiser Medical Center in San Diego. Amazing organization. And I think my first nurse ended up being Sherry Case, who I didn't know at that time, but we've kept in touch and we chat back and forth. She made me comfortable. I signed an order, an agreement to ventilate if I had to go to the ICU. And I said, I also want to sign a do not resuscitate. So I was determined that, hey, I'd had a great life. I don't think this is going to work. So I signed a do not resuscitate. I had made sure right before I came to the hospital and on my phone while I was there to make sure my family knew all the password information for our financial accounts. I sold stocks while I was in the hospital, coughing and choking, made sure that they transferred money. I did all this stuff to make sure that I thought they were okay. I texted another friend, hey, I don't know if I'm going to make it. Being a pilot, I said, can you help my family and sell the planes? And then basically I told my wife I was scared and I turned off the phone because I didn't want to see their response. So about a couple hours later, by this time I was, barely conscious. They hadn't even given me anything yet, but I was just out of it. I was in the ICU. And then I remember just barely being in the ICU. That's about it. After that, that was it for 10 days. I was in an induced coma, and I was out. So they immediately, as I said, went from the ER to the ICU to ventilating. And they gave me some drugs, which they knew would have maybe some benefit, hydroxychloroquine at the time, but they didn't have anything else to do at the time. But there was a drug trial for remdesivir, and two of the doctors, Dr. Murray and then Dr. Vi Bowman, got a hold of Jane, said, hey, there's a remdesivir trial, and we think Rich could benefit from it. And Jane says, he told them, he said, hey, Rich would want to do this, whether it's successful or not. He'd want to volunteer. So they signed me up as literally one of the absolute last people to get approved to get into the program. So I got approved. The caveat was they had to stop doing everything else. In other words, any other drugs they thought were helping me at the time, antibiotics, hydroxychloroquine, everything, they had to stop. So they stopped all those for over 24 hours before they started remdesivir. But it seemed to have worked. And so I was in that coma, had some crazy dreams, actually pretty pleasant dreams. And being a pilot, of course, two of them involved airplanes. One flying to Vegas to get back to Kaiser. Another one was I was in New York at a Kaiser Medical Center, and I remember the dreams vividly because normally I don't remember dreams. But I was going like, so how did they get me here? Did they air medevac me here or do it by an ambulance train? I just remember these things. It was really bizarre. And then, unbeknownst to me at the time, my family, Tigre in particular, our son, had posted on Facebook, like you mentioned, And he also and Jane started a daily blog that they kept internally, a private document that had all their observations, all the observations of what had happened before I went to the hospital. Like Jane would write in my temperatures, everything else, oxygen. That's how we know these things. Every conversation they had with the doctors, even the test results. So Tigray would post every day on Google Sheets bar graphs and details of every one of my blood tests and data. And since I was on part of this trial, they would take 7 vials a day of blood. So they did a lot of different blood tests. So he would have that. The doctors had access to it as well as their own medical systems within Kaiser. And then doctors that I knew from my relief work in Haiti who lived back east got involved. And then local researchers in the San Diego who knew me got involved. So my medical team really was comprised of all these amazing doctors at Kaiser who had almost daily conversations with my doctor friends back east and in San Diego for my care. So everybody was involved, which was amazing. And Tigray at the time also started a fundraiser to raise money for the orphanage and school that we've been supporting in Haiti since the earthquake. So all those things happen. Of course, unbeknownst to me, I'm just in a coma, losing weight, lost 12% of my weight during that event. And then all of a sudden, they started to reduce the sedation. I come partially awake and realize I've got this thing stuck down my throat, but then I'm alive. So that was a surprise because I didn't think I was going to wake up. So I had the ventilator down my throat, and I'm choking because I still have pneumonia, and this thing's down my throat, and they're trying to aspirate me at the same time. And so using crude hand signals, I said, and I'm in and out of consciousness, I would like the ventilator removed, right? I motioned to pull it out. So I remember the nurses said, can't remember his name. Well, there had multiple nurses, but when the male nurses said, so you really want this removed, don't you? I said, yeah, I want this removed. And so they told the doctors, and the doctors said, hey, he's so insistent, we're going to remove it early. And also at the same time, Anna, one of my nurses, they all knew I was a pilot. They all knew I was volunteered for the Angel flight. They knew my Haiti flights. People had been sending them videos and everything, and the medical team. And so poor team. And so they knew all this. And so Anna, one of the nurses says, Rich, you got to open your eyes. You got to open your eyes. You got to open your eyes, because she knew as a pilot, all that was important. And just today, I remember her saying that. And so I kind of motioned, like, when are you going to pull out the ventilator? And they looked at me and go, 1, 2, 3, pull, and boom, pull it out of my lungs and my throat, right? So I was choking, still had the pneumonia. And then I was determined at that time, I was still in the ICU, that by God, I'm going to work as hard as I could to recover, since they worked so hard to save my life. So I couldn't talk hardly at all. I had them give me a suction device so I could suction the mucus out of my throat as far down as I could when I coughed, because I knew if I didn't cough and get this out of here, I was going to be on the ventilator again. So terrible coughs, painful. I mean, just hurt like heck the whole time. And then they had me in the bed, and they had me restrained because they would pull stuff out and so forth for a while. But my legs, I could raise my legs a little bit. So they were exhausted, so I started doing leg lifts in the ICU, a couple inches at a time is the most, and then I put them down. I was exhausted. I'd do reps, keep on doing that. I was exhausted. Then I'd do that for a few minutes and then just pass out. I was just so tired. So I kept on progressing to that. Every time I was awake, I would do my own exercises, and I drank water like crazy. Gosh, you're thirsty when you come out of there. And they would give me a little bit of ice, but not much, but they wouldn't give me anything to drink. A very little small bit of ice, just a few chips. So, but they would give me ice bags, and I still had a fever. In the ICU, when I was under, they had put even a cooling blanket of water on me. So I was still boiling. And I said, God, it's hot in here. And they said, Rich, we got it down to 68.5 in your room. I said, I'm just so hot, I need ice bags. So they'd bring me ice bags, multiple ones, and I would just lay them on my body. And then I also realized, oh, these are filled with ice. They're not chemical ice bags. So I'd look through my window, see if the nurses weren't there. And since I was melting them so rapidly, I would open them up and drink the water from the melted ice. Then I closed them back up. And later on I asked Anna, did you ever notice that they were empty? She said, oh, come to think of it, I never did. I said, well, that's because I was drinking all the ice as it melted. And so she would say, oh, that's what happened. And so that's sort of every time I'd do that. They knew I had a degree in pharmacy. So when I could talk, I told them how I would like the drugs reduced, the sedation drugs. And so they listened and really worked with me. And so that was Saturday. I had it pulled out. Monday, they put me out of ICU into my own room somewhere else. Well, I had my own room in the ICU too, but it's called a medical surgical ward. So that was Monday. IVs, they stuck a high, very intense IV in me for antibiotics to try to get the double pneumonia down and the fevers. And then on Tuesday, one of my doctors came in, Sapna Iyer, and I said, you don't have to come in. Just talk to me on the phone. They said, no, we'd like to see you. So they came in, all masked up. Think about it, you're in isolation. You haven't seen your family except on FaceTime, which is awesome. Nurses and doctors, they have to do double gowning, double mask, everything, every time they come in and see you. And when they leave, they have to strip it all off, go back out. So I told them, stay out of my room for your own safety. Don't only come in absolute necessary. I'll call you. So she comes in and I told her, and I said, I'm pretty scruffy looking. I've got a beard and all that stuff. And I said, I'm going to be out of here Friday. And couldn't barely talk. She said, I make that decision when you leave. I said, okay. So that was Tuesday. So I continued to do my exercise every time I woke up in the middle of the night. I would sit there and I would just do my leg lifts. I lifted my arms. I would do isometrics on the bed by just finding anything I could grab to and just try to build my strength. And I still couldn't get out of bed by myself at all, without a question. I couldn't get out. I don't even think I got out of the bed until Tuesday with help, and that was literally for 10 seconds, and then I'd collapse. So I just said, I'm going to do this. I'm going to push. The nutritionists were amazing. I'd call down. They even made a smoothie, even though they normally don't. They made a smoothie for me. They made me a BLT sandwich. They said, we'll put extra bacon on it because they were worried I was going to waste away in the hospital. It was just so funny. And then, and while I was in the hospital, I had Jane drop off the computer. She couldn't see me, but they could drop it off and sterilize it for me. So even in the ICU, I started to do work on Angel Flight and computer and get ready for my volunteer stuff and communicate people, even communicate with my AME on some other things. And talk about that. And then Thursday, Dr. Iyer came in. She says, I don't know how you did it. You're cleared medically to go. And by that time, I was going really? I'd really actually like to stay here a few more days. I was exhausted. This is not a good thing to do. I remember getting up just out of a chair and coming back and collapsing on my bed, just spread eagled. And just 2 hours later, I woke up. Okay. So they finished an IV the next morning, Friday. So they, from 2 ventilator being pulled out on Saturday till when I was cleared to go was Thursday, and I left Friday morning. And I was determined as a pilot, of course. I didn't want to leave with any prescriptions, so I was determined to work hard. And they came in to prove whether I was going to be able to leave, and they said, well, can you show us what you can do? And I said, okay. So I showed them doing leg lifts, 40 or more each leg and other things. They said, my God, you can do it. But again, it probably wasn't the smartest thing to leave that early. So the same thing when I talked before when I said, oh, I can do it. And then later on, finally, I wonder if that was the best decision at the time. But I was driven to get out of there. So I left with no oxygen prescription, no drugs, just an over-the-counter throat lozenge from the ventilator and 2 PT. So I got out on Friday. Jane and our son Tigre and the grandkids came to see me at a distance, and Jane took me home. Jane, my wife, had gotten it from me, and so hers were mild symptoms, just headache and loss of taste and smells. So that Dr. Ira, remember Sapness, told me, said, "Hey, good thing is your wife's already had it, so you don't have to quarantine from her and isolate from her." I said, "Great." So then I was home. So that's sort of that experience there. The interesting thing is right before I have a first-class medical and do Part 135 work. The FAA had written me a letter about something else in my medical record. It was just really, really stupid. It was like the fact that I had one episode of shingles. I went, "You got to be kidding." So while I was in the hospital, I got hold of my AME, and he worked with FAA, and we got that resolved even when I was in the hospital. So that was kudos to my AME, John Raniolo, who took care of that for me. And then got out that Friday. That was the 17th of April. Done with quarantine on May 1st. That day I went flying in my Cirrus with Jane. So I was just determined when I got out, and I was coughing like crazy when I left. By the time 2 weeks later, I was substantially better. Every few minutes, I would get up and walk around and come back and collapse on the bed for a few days. And so it just really drove that recovery. I wasn't going to let this disease take me down like it has so many other people. And I was fortunate to have this just amazing Carrot Kaiser. So that's kind of the story up to that point, up to the start of the recovery.
That's incredible. Do you think that if you'd taken the antibiotics at the very beginning, that would have changed the course of things, or do you think that would have really have had any effect?
I think that would have helped. I think that would have helped that infection because the lungs, because if you look at my blood panel, in some cases, some of the immune response was 45 times the normal range. Now, the fascinating thing is that a week after I was discharged from the hospital, I go in and get additional blood tests. And when I go in there, they come back, they say, "We don't know how this happened, but all of my numbers were back to the lower range of normal." Every one of them. And I have no pre-existing conditions going in. My blood pressure's been 150 and 120 over 80 for 40 some odd years. And so I had no issues. But the recovery of the body's ability sometimes to recover was just amazing. I thought for sure those things would be high. All my immune responses, every parameter was back to the lower end of normal. I was coughing. It was still, fatigue and so forth, but everything else was just fine. And I just pushed myself all the time to read, to work, everything to get my body back mentally and physically back in shape so that I could continue to fly. And then I got off the quarantine on the 1st of May, flew that day, flew the next day in my eclipse. I felt fine. 2 days later, I did my 6158 in my eclipse. A week later from that, I was at flight safety doing my PC-12 Part 135 recurrent. So that was intense. So all those proved that I could fly. That was important to me. I wanted to be safe. It's important to be safe. So I thought a 5-day intense recurrent at flight safety, and the intensity of that both mentally for all the studying and so forth, as well as all the flight checks and everything, are a good indication of my mental health and health as an aviator, because that's important as pilots. And then a few weeks after that, I added another type rating, this time in the Premier. That was a 19-day stint in Wichita. And so some people aren't as fortunate. I can't say that everybody, if they followed my sort of process, would have the same outcome. But I was just driven to do that. I rode bikes. I walked till I was exhausted. Then I would rest for a minute or two and then do it again. So just driven to be able to get all that back into shape, to be able to do that. So yeah, that's kind of, as a safety officer Range Flight West, then I worked actually when I was in the hospital. How do we resume these flights safely? How do we do these things? So that's what we were talking about earlier in the earlier part of your podcast of, hey, we have to come up with a process of how to keep everyone safe, but resume volunteer flights. And so we resumed them on June 8th. Help a lot of people, and we've done a lot of flights since then with patients. In the interim, we did a lot of PPE flights, taking PPE notably to a lot of, as I mentioned earlier, to the Native American tribes in the Southwest. And now I spend a lot of my time at trying to educate people about COVID as well as all the other flight instruction. And since I started flying again May 1st, I've done about 200 flights, a little bit over 300 hours. And just finished another recurrent this week.
Well, that's an incredible journey, and I followed you on Facebook, and I can't believe that things came out so well, and just glad it all was able to have a positive outcome at the end, and now you can share this incredible story with everybody else.
Yeah, and it's important to do that, I think, right? I help us long-term COVID survivors group on Facebook, and I try to help those and try to give them encouragement. I help the doctors. They're using my information, the doctors at Kaiser, and the details that I gave them about my recovery and my feelings and everything with their other patients, even down to the point where I told them how I felt under the anesthetic so that they could know what anesthetic works well in the comas. And then in August, I got another, was it August or July? No, it was late July. I got what I call love letter from FAA saying, oh, by the way, you have your medical, however, we want you to prove it. So under COVID, and I totally understand. So I sent them 1,055 pages. So think about 2 reams of paper of my hospitalization record to them for their review. And I haven't heard back yet, but I totally understand that they need to be careful about this because this is something pretty serious. And if you're hospitalized, and that's where the restrictions are now, if you're hospitalized or in an ICU, they really need to get more information and verify that as an aviator, you'll be safe in the air. Yeah. I totally understand that. So it'll be interesting to see what they come up with. Yeah. So.
Well, incredible.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for being here. This has been great. I love listening to you talk about these topics. It's wonderful.
Well, it's different, and I think that if you look throughout mankind, right? You look at through mankind, one of the ways we learn is through storytelling, right? And so in the ancient, when humans first did, they had pictographs, right? We've seen those on walls and TV and so forth and books. And then they would do oral communications, and then we do books and TV and shows and podcasts, all these things. So a lot of that's, how can you learn and learn from other people's mistakes? And I've done a lot of them in a lot of fields, including flying after 12,000 hours. Like I tell my students when I point out something they've done, I said, hey, I guarantee I've done it too. So yeah, and that to me is just sort of giving back to the community to be able to share information.
Well, that's an incredible story. And after that, I'm sure, I hope at least, that you have some comments or something you'd like to send into the show to talk about what Rich said. So make sure to shoot me an email, Brandon@podcastingonaplane.com, or better yet, use your smartphone or SpeakPipe widget that pops up when you visit podcastingonaplane.com to record me something. And who knows, might even end up on the show. And don't worry, you can do multiple takes. It's okay. On the website, maybe consider supporting the show too. If you find value in it, I'd really appreciate having you on board as a patron. You get the episodes early and sometimes other fun stuff too. And if you're not into a recurring thing, well, you can head over to buymeacoffee.com/Bravo Golf spelled out. Do the one-time thing in increments of just $3. Or on the website, there's a PayPal link too. If you want to stay sharp on the mic, make sure you use the affiliate code DELTA at PlainEnglishSim.com. That'll get you 10% off the best smartphone-based ATC Radiocom sim around. There's, of course, a link in the show notes for that too. Just swipe up to get it. And as always, I thank you so much for your support in whatever form it takes and for listening to the show and passing the word along about this or any aviation podcast to a friend. That's all for now. Your frequency change is approved until next time, and report back on this frequency for the next episode. Good day.
Podcasting on a Plane podcast is presented for entertainment purposes only. Brandon's comments and those of his guests, the website's content and any of the social media, etc., are not part of his official responsibility as a controller or as an FAA employee. The views and opinions you hear on the podcast are his, and those of his guests, and not necessarily that of the FAA. Also, while he's a CFI, he's not acting as your CFI, nor is he your mechanic, your doctor, your shrink, or your spouse. This podcast is presented for entertainment, camaraderie and fun, but is in no way, shape or form professional advice or legal counsel. If you're in need of professional advice, get some from somewhere more appropriate than a podcast, no matter how good this one may be.